A Time to Stir, Columbia, 1968. Paul Cronin, editor. Foreword by Paul Berman. In the spring of 1968, I was a wide-eyed freshman at Columbia College and a militant agitator for the left-wing cause. And the student uprising that broke out at my university seemed to me to be one of history's hugest events, on par with the Peloponnesian War or the Russian Revolution. Half a century later, I have tempered my evaluation, and yet, I have to confess, not in every regard. The Columbia University student uprising was, in fact, authentically large. And it was mysteriously dynamic, which made it larger still. Perhaps the dynamism was not obvious to everyone at the time. The professors who watched in astonishment failed to see it sometimes, and so too did the journalists. But we students saw it. We felt it in the flesh. We trembled. My own organization in those days was an August left-wing youth movement with an ancient history, founded in 1905 as the Intercollegiate Socialist Society under the leadership of none other than Jack London. The Intercollegiate Socialist Society was a noble movement, and it evolved after a while into a practical movement too. It became a youth auxiliary of the Social Democratic Trade Unions under a more modern-sounding name, the Student League for Industrial Democracy, or SLID. And it took on a mighty responsibility, which was to train young people in the grandest traditions of the American liberal left, the traditions that are pro-labor, pro-civil rights, egalitarian, and democratic. Maybe SLID was not a good acronym. At the start of the 60s, the members wisely changed the name yet again to the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. Only a war between the generations was by then beginning to break out, and the student leaders of renamed organization could no longer get along with their adult sponsors. The sponsors were hard-boiled social democrats in the old left style, and they demanded conformity to social democratic dogma. The students demurred. The elders changed the locks. SDS, like a young reprobate who has been thrown out of the family home, wandered off on its own, bereft of adult guidance, but free, at least, to follow the dictates of youthful whim. And somehow the mysterious dynamism began to stir. By the spring of 1968, the SDS chapter at Columbia had blossomed into a vigorous campus organization, commanding the allegiance of perhaps 200 or 300 students, with a few dozen people as the activist core and an action faction of red hots in the leadership. Every last person among those hundreds of SDSers was upset in the extreme about America's participation in the Vietnam War, upset that in the early days of 1968, 1,000 American soldiers a week were getting killed in Vietnam, and many more Vietnamese. Everyone was upset about civil rights, perhaps not as intensely for the moment, but upset in any case. Then came April, and Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and a new movement arrived. Riots broke out in a variety of cities. Riots seemed to be a hair away from breaking out in Harlem, down the hill from the Columbia campus. And in that atmosphere, sulfuric, enraging, disorienting, the SDS chapter struck up an alliance or coalition with one other student group. The students in SDS's Columbia chapter were white, except for a few. The coalition partner, however, was the Students Afro-American Society, or SAS, whose own membership consisted of the first sizable contingent of Black students ever to enroll at Columbia. Not everybody within that contingent, but a large enough portion to be able to make claims for the Black students as a whole. The alliance between those two groups, the SDS and the SAS, was entirely logical and not especially easy. The students of SAS, in their sundry currents of opinion, had by no means broken with their own elders, and their connections to the broader Black community conferred on them, or so I thought at the time and still think, a more sophisticated appreciation of American reality than could sometimes be found among SDSers. Still, the two organizations held a joint rally. And by joining together, the two groups touched off an explosion of unexpected emotion and a chain of further explosions, something really extraordinary, an explosion of political anger among a few hundred students, and then a few thousand, and more thousands, together with some of the younger and radical professors and friends and families, an anger that could no longer be expressed by oratory or pamphlets or chants and slogans, but only by physical action. The explosion of anger produced, the sequence of events that you will read about in the pages of this book, a minor scuffle with the police, which led to the seizure of a classroom building, which led to the seizure of still more buildings, which led to the university president to call in a large number of police, which led to a couple of nights of fighting and a great many injuries, most of them superficial, but some grave and lasting, with the policeman the most gravely injured of all, and many hundreds of arrests, which led to still larger crowds, sometimes from outside the university, marching through the uptown streets amid clouds of rage, bitterness, alienation, and confusion, a genuine insurrection, mostly nonviolent, apart from those 2 terrible nights, unplanned mass emitting fumes of utopian exhilaration, for such was America in the spring of 1968. Then came the summer, and the Columbia Uprising gave way to the police versus demonstrator rioting outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and the fall, when a number of additional student revolts broke out around the country, and the spring of 1969, likewise, and the fall, until in the spring of 1970, a national anti-war student strike succeeded in mobilizing millions of the students, which amounted to one of the largest protests ever to take place in the United States. Nor did Columbia manage to calm down during those next years, as I well remember, for the uprising of 1968 receded into the past, and even so, the embers went on smoldering, and some of us students were always demonstrating, or plotting to demonstrate, or marching here and there, always with the exception that, at any moment, the original insurrection might break out anew. The mysterious dynamism at Columbia in 1968, then, was the source of that dynamism finally. The book that Paul Cronin has put together, A Time to Stir, contains more than 60 essays or statements by people who participated on one side or the other in the Columbia events. And the contributions make clear that, on the first level, nothing about it was really mysterious. Anger is combustible, and it combusted. Still, there were other levels. Everyone who thinks back on those times will recall that a variety of thoughts and feelings, some of them fairly vague, without immediate connection to any particular outrage or campus issue, entered into the insurrectionary mood. Among the good many students, not just the radicals, there was a suspicion that American society as a whole has taken a wrong turn. A worried suspicion that impersonal institutions had lost contact with ordinary humanity and with moral behavior, and the whole of society had begun to lose its human quality. Maybe there was another suspicion, which was shared by a lively vanguard. It was a suspicion that traditional ways of organizing the relations of men and women and of sexuality in general had ceased to make sense, or perhaps had never made sense. A suspicion that every last social custom and habit needed to be re-examined and reinvented, not just in the political world, but in the realms of private behavior and domestic life. That was a shapeless idea for the moment, and yet the shapeless idea kept intruding into student actions, and uprisings broke out within the student uprising, with young women rebelling or muttering under their teeth in preparation to rebel against their uncomprehending comrades, the young men, a rebellion within the rebellion that would turn out to be massively influential in years to come. Or maybe the dynamism at Columbia grew on another source, deeper and broader than everything else, and yet oddly invisible, an impulse to rebel whose existence can be inferred from a mass of evidence, but unlike some unknown particle in physics, cannot be otherwise be detected or described. The massive evidence in this case was worldwide. The uprising at Columbia was spectacular, but it was not unique. In several parts of the world, similar uprisings, sometimes nearly identical in style, broke out during those same weeks and months. The largest and most spectacular uprising of all, roughly simultaneous to the one at Columbia, got started in a small way in the last week of March 1968 at a university in Paris suburbs. The uprising spread to the Sorbonne in Paris itself, and then produced something that is accurately denominated the Night of the Barricades, then spread to further schools elsewhere in France, and ultimately made the leap into the zones of organized labor, where it generated perhaps the largest general strike the world has ever seen, quite as if France as a whole were teetering on the brink of revolution. The French student uprising spread to Italy, and West Germany, and in varying degrees to everywhere else in Western Europe. Even Spain, which was fascist dictatorship in those days, underwent a free tremors. People in North Africa felt the vibration. An enormous student uprising took place in Mexico City and elsewhere in Mexico, only to be suppressed with a massacre by the police at the Tlatelolco Plaza in October 1968, which produced dozens of deaths, or perhaps hundreds. No one is known for sure. And the Mexican student uprising spread elsewhere in Latin America. The student movement in Japan was significant, and likewise in South Korea. Student protests broke out in the Soviet bloc countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and even ever so slightly in Moscow. The protests in Warsaw in February and March were among the earliest of the student rebellions of 1968, although hardly anyone knew about them in the rest of the world, given the Polish censorship. The young people's fervor in what was the then Czechoslovakia became, in contrast, exceptionally visible, if only because a reform wing of the Communist Party rose to power in Prague, and in the months before the Soviet Union sent in the tanks, intolerably indulged the ebullience of the younger generation. Among the many young people's protests and uprisings around the world in 1968, the ones in Poland and Czechoslovakia and other East Bloc countries eventually proved to be, in all, the most consequential, judged from a conventional political standpoint. For every one of these Eastern Bloc protests was suppressed. The leaders sometimes ended up in jail, sometimes for several years. And yet, from those protests emerged a series of tiny dissident movements which germinated underground until, in 1989, the tiny movements blossomed into mass insurrections and democratic revolutions, typically under the leadership of the then grizzled veterans of 1968. There was the example of Václav Havel, a leading personality among the young dissidents of Prague in 1968. In the spring of that year, an opportunity came Havel's way to visit New York. And because the Columbia Uprising was underway, he made a point of going uptown to take a look, which meant that among the sympathetic faces in the enormous crowds of Columbia was his own face. Many a young hero in the Columbia Rebellion of 1968 dreamed of one day leading a revolution. And here was a man who actually did it. The revolution of 1989, which no revolution in modern times has been more beautiful or more successful. Only, what can account for the worldwide impulse to rebel, the impulse in 1968? It could not have been the reaction to any particular set of concrete issues or controversies, for America's political movements for civil rights and withdrawal from the Vietnam conflict mattered greatly to people in many countries. And yet, in each country, rebellion students and young people had reason to emphasize priorities of their own. Which were not necessarily America's or Vietnam's. Was the casual factor of something abstract, a political belief perhaps, which, having arisen in one place or another, proved to be irresistibly attractive? A political belief that spread contagiously around the world? That may well be the explanation, but I don't think so, even if the explanation begs the question of what political contagions. For no one can deny that in university neighborhoods all over the world in 1968, on both sides of the Cold War, students and young people did seem to share an ideal. They considered themselves to be idealists of the left in some fashion or another. Only, what did it mean to be on the left in those days and settings? On this matter, a worldwide consensus did not exist. There was not much agreement, even within those few small blocks of the Columbia campus. The largest single sentiment among the rebelling students there and among their faculty friends was an exacerbated and radicalized liberalism in the American vein, an angry left liberalism perhaps, and even the word liberal had come to sound darkly criminal. Naturally, the Columbia left liberalism came in many stripes. There were Christian radicals of different sorts, beginning with the religious-minded admirers of Martin Luther King. Dwight McDonald showed up on campus on a couple of occasions to orate on behalf of his version of anarchism, which likewise had its liberal side, and he too had admirers in a small way. And then again, there were sophisticated champions of post-Trotskyist and anti-Stalinism, who might have regarded liberal as an insult. Philosophical disciplines of the Frankfurt School of Marxists, radical pacifists, admirers of Malcolm X, who renamed the university after him in the course of the uprising, an occasional Communist Party recruiter from the 1930s, skulking about, and whole crowds of countercultural freaks who just sneered at politicos and participated in the uprising only when some demonstration proved to be historic, which was all the time for a few weeks, or when some musicians were performing. The ideological variations and divagations and contradictions within the SDS were especially complex, for once the uprising was underway, the members of the SAS and their friends and allies elected to pursue an autonomous course, which strengthened the rebellion 10 times over by attracting a warm and fervent support from the larger Black community, but also left FDS free for a few weeks to dominate the rest of the uprising. And SDS's political philosophy turned out to be several things at once. The particular strand of American social democracy that had given birth to SDS was liberal socialist and aggressively democratic, which meant anti-communist in the trade union style. And at Columbia in 1968, the social democratic legacy still clung to life in spite of everything. The SDS literature table on the steps of Lowell Library distributed a pamphlet about Che Guevara, but it also distributed the old SDS manifesto, the Port Huron Statement from 1962, before SDS and the old-time Social Democrats had severed relations. The Port Huron Statement offered many sharp and well-phrased social criticisms, not just of American society. It said, as Democrats, we are in basic opposition to the communist system, which the Social Democrats of the older generation would have applauded, but Che would have condemned. I don't know how many students at Columbia actually read the Port Huron Statement, but I'm guessing most of the people who did so have felt the way that I felt. I loved it. I was proud to belong to a student organization that possessed such a lofty manifesto. I suspect that without his historic connection to the socialist tradition and the ideas found in the Port Huron Statement, without phrases like participatory democracy, the SDS chapter at Columbia would not have attracted as big a following as it did. And on the other hand, within the chapter itself, people were by then reading pamphlets from the Little Lenin Library, which the old Social Democrats would never have allowed. Stalin's On the National Question was passed from hand to hand, and some of the SDS leaders, some of the very people who found themselves thrust for a while into leadership of the mainstream of the insurrection, were beginning to define themselves, at least in private, as revolutionary communists. That was a fateful phrase, and it hinted all too strongly at the gods of destruction and self-destruction that were already beginning to seduce one SDSer after another, my own circle of friends, under the Guevarist name of guerrilla Marxism. A miserable tragedy in months to come. It did not help that within SDS, the main opposition to the ultras leadership came from a pro-Chinese splinter of the American Communist Party called the Progressive Labor Party, whose cadre at Columbia excluded and exhausted fumes of fanaticism and Maoist dogma, which everybody else had to inhale. Still another faction consisted of brainy disciplines of a cackled and incoherent cult leader from some Trotskyist background known as Lynn Marcus or Lyndon LaRouche, who promoted apocalyptic conspiracy theories. Here then was a tumult of ideological confusion. The tumult spelled outward from SDS meetings into public events. The oratory at student rallies was pretty wild sometimes. The sundial must have blinked in astonishment. Solid doctrines and mad theories were marching arm in arm through the quads. It was the revolution of 1848 as described by a horrified Flaubert. The best of people were sane today and out of their minds tomorrow. And this is true of student uprisings across the world. In Mexico City, the students ardently yearned for democracy, and just as ardently venerated the megamaniacal dictator of Cuba without appearing to notice the contradiction. In France, where the level of left-wing political education was exceptionally high, the most prominent leader of the uprising was Danny the Red, or Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who, on anarchist grounds, regarded himself as a visceral anti-communist. And even so, a great mass of the rebelling students aligned themselves with the sprinkling of Trotsky sects, and a still greater mass identified with a sprinkling of Maoist proto-guerrilla sects. In the Eastern Bloc countries, the student rebels were politically more consistent, at least so on the topic of communism, about which no one had any illusions. And even so, the Eastern Bloc 68ers admired their Western counterparts in Paris, Frankfurt, New York, and California, and everywhere else, and yearned for the freedom to resemble them. Well, what did it all add up to then, this worldwide student uprising? You can easily conclude that it did not add up. Somehow it did, though. Young people around the world certainly felt that it did. This was obvious at the time, and in any case, I know it to be true because over the years, my labors as writer and citizens have brought me into conversations on comparative insurrectionary themes with the radical student leaders from 1968 for maybe a dozen countries. Each and every one of those conversations has reminded me how vividly felt was the spirit of solidarity from one country or continent to another, and how warmly the veterans of those rebellions had tended to recall the spirit in later years, even if in one country or another, the old veterans have also shuddered in recollection of the spirit of destruction. Those people felt the solidarity back in the day because they pictured themselves as a generational cohort that had been thrown into the conflict with their elders, not in every instance, but often enough. They felt a solidarity because they knew they shared a disdain for the conventional symbols and hierarchies of success and power, another worldwide phenomenon. They shared an impulse for cultural impudence, and they shared of themselves as people engaged in a revolutionary project to make a better world, even if there was not the slightest consensus on how to picture that better world or how to get there or how to avoid falling into the nihilist chasm. They knew they shared a notion, whatever might be the proper philosophy for a young people's movement. The reasons to rebel were undeniable, even if some of those reasons were inscrutable. And young people ought to rebel, and they ought to do so right now, a belief so urgent it felt explosive. And so they rebelled. Paul Berman, 1971, Columbia College, is the author of, among other books, 2 volumes on the generation of 1968 around the world, The Tale of Two Utopias and Power and the Idealists, which have been translated into many languages. He has contributed to the New York Times Book Review since 1979. He's been a columnist on staff of the New Republic, the New Yorker, the Village Voice, Slate, Tablet, and other magazines. He has taught at several universities and has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the MacArthur and Guggenheim Foundations. He is a member of the editorial board of Dissent magazine.